Is it possible to turn your worst moment into your best? Is it possible to take a bad circumstance and flip it, turn it into something good? Now, before you say no, I want to give you an example of an entire town that did it. Things were so bad in this place that people just didn't even want to drive through it. If they had to, they rolled up their windows so they wouldn't have to breathe the air. And yet this town took what could have been a catastrophe and turned it into a bright, shining example that the rest of the nation envied. That town is the town you're sitting in, Hickory, North Carolina. It was the summer of 1944. Not really a good time for another problem. We were busy with World War II. In fact, Catawba was doing what every other county in the United States was doing, and that is sending its best off to fight a two-front war. This is footage of Hickory from that very same year. And the people left here were taking care of the home front. They were supplying the things that the war effort needed. People in Hickory were very, very clued in to what was going on with the war. They read about it in banner headlines every day, the progress of the Allies during the war in the Hickory Daily Record. It was a scary time already, and yet it got even scarier. One thing that happened was when the people of Hickory found out about the D-Day invasion, they rang the bells at Corinth Reformed Church. It happened to be 2:45 in the morning on the 7th of June, but they wanted to know. 2 days later, in the paper, came the notice of another invasion. This one's smaller, quiet, but no less deadly. This invasion was a virus, and it was attacking our most vulnerable citizens, our children. It was polio. Now, polio had been around for a very long time. The ancient Egyptians had cases of polio, but more recently in the 20th century, towns and communities throughout the United States would see epidemics of this disease rise up. In 1935, there was a small epidemic in Catawba County, but in those days, there wasn't much doctors could do. All they could tell the parents was, take your child home, put out a sign in your front window like this, keep them away from other children, and hope for the best. Things began to change, though, in 1938 when Franklin Roosevelt, who himself had polio, founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, also known as the March of Dimes, because that's how they raised money, dime at a time. And he committed their resources to helping out these epidemics as they came to these cities. We didn't know where it was going to happen each year, but it did. And along the way, they would study this disease with the hope of eventually finding a cure, a vaccine for it. In June of 1944, the cases began to mount. Doctors here didn't know what to do. At first, they said, well, we'll keep children separated. We will ban them from all public places, 12 and under. That kept them out of the movie theaters, kept them out of the parks, kept them away from each other. But that didn't stop the situation. Cases continued to mount. And it really comes down to 3 healthcare professionals who understood this problem better than anybody else. They were the county health nurse, Frances Allen, the county health director, Dr. H.C. Wims, and the local chair of the National Foundation, Dr. Gaither Hahn. They knew what was going on better than anybody else, and they led doctors to come up with what I would argue would be a fateful and rather radical choice. They were the ones who said, we have to locate a hospital here. Now, early patients had been sent to Charlotte, quickly filled up. Same thing with the orthopedic hospital in Gastonia. Some of those patients were being sent home. There was no place else to send them. The local hospitals couldn't take them. They already had sick people. It would endanger them even further. So Nurse Allen, she along with Dr. Wims and Dr. Hahn, said, if we're going to establish it, we've got to find a place. Well, there's a 300-acre tract of land out on the northeast side beyond the town limits of Hickory on the banks of the Catawba River. They looked at that place and said, yes, we can use that. The only building they had there was this stone building that was built by the WPA a few years before. But it's a workable site. We can go from there. And so they planned quickly. On the morning of Thursday, June 22nd, at dawn, they began the process of building. Now, they had the place. They had the backing of the National Foundation, who was committing all kinds of resources, doctors, call for nurses, money, a lot of things they needed. But they didn't know if the local population would come out for this. Now, think about the danger here. If you're a parent, would you come help build this place? You might take polio back home to your children or to your loved ones. We so didn't understand what polio was about in that era that anything was possible. People said it was just in the air. So there was a real fear that you could cripple your own children, maybe even kill them, by being an unwitting carrier of polio. But on that morning, folks came out. The report was it wasn't a party atmosphere. They were very businesslike. And they went to work converting this camp into an emergency hospital. They worked throughout the day Thursday. Into the night, they brought in spotlights so they could continue to work. More people came. Friday, more and more people showed up. Until on Saturday afternoon, 54 hours after they started, they received the first patient. They said, anyone who has polio, come. And they started to come. That wasn't all the building that was necessary, though, by the way. The construction continued all summer and into the fall because they were just really getting started on June 24th when they accepted those first patients. It continued on into the fall when they were building more permanent wards out of wood. The early ones were tents. But all through that summer, we see an outpouring of support on the part of the people of Hickory and beyond to make this hospital work. It was incredible. The Rotary Club procured an iron lung, brought it in. Spain Hours, a local retailer, was asked for 50 sheets for the beds. They gave 100. Thousands of stories, more than I have time to tell you, of giving on the part of this hospital. And another interesting thing, when a patient came, they were fitted with the next bed. And what I mean by that is it didn't matter if you were black or white. Remember, we're in the Jim Crow South, so race mattered in those days, not in this hospital. In the early days of the hospital, we didn't worry about that nonsense of segregation. All kinds of people gave in all kinds of different ways. One of the more interesting is a reverend by the name of Stroup, who was the pastor at the Episcopal Church of the Ascension. He served as clearinghouse for a lot of things that the doctors needed. When they needed baby beds, they went to Reverend Stroup, and he went on HKY, the radio station, or in the pages of the paper and said, we need baby beds. They got them. He called for fans. People brought fans out of their own homes. Remember, this is summer. Out of their own homes and donated them to this effort. Probably the strangest thing that he asked for was harmonicas. And he got them. The reason was doctors said these patients need to strengthen their lungs, so by playing harmonicas, that would be a way to do that. When the governor of North Carolina came and visited the hospital, he played harmonicas, Melvin Broughton, he played harmonicas with those patients. It was incredible, the effort. Farmers brought food. Everything this hospital needed was taken care of. It's hard to say who had it worse here. Was it the children who came to the hospital and didn't know that who was going to be taking care of them, because once they were diagnosed, they were put in quarantine. Their parents didn't see them anymore. One patient said that the younger kids would cry all day, I want to go home, I want to go home. They didn't understand why they were there. Or was it worse on the parents who gave their kids to these doctors not knowing if they'd ever see them alive again? One parent's story sticks out. His name was T.R. Bryan. He was a lawyer and he was from Wilkesboro. Suspected that his 5-year-old son John had polio. Brought him immediately to the hospital. It's a good thing he did, because within 12 hours of getting there, John came down with not one, but 2 types of polio. It took his limbs, and it also went into his lungs, the bulbar type, so that he couldn't breathe. For 6 weeks, he was on that breathing machine. He was also fed by a feeding tube. John's case was so bad that TR was told, go home and plan your son's funeral. 3 days later, they found Lawyer Brian. He was in the kitchen. He was washing dishes. And they said to him, you got to go home. And this was his reply. I'm sort of like one of the boards that went into a wall. People here all work to the breaking point. They work for my boy and other people's children. I want to stay and work too. John Bryan, the son, is probably the most engaging person you'll ever meet. He just celebrated his 80th birthday. And he says he has this hospital to thank for his life and the children he subsequently had. That was John right there. This hospital has been referred to as miraculous. And I don't know if miracles happen, but if they do, this hospital should probably be on the list. One of the ways word got out about it was for a reporter for the Daily Record, Wake Bridges. Wake was a character. He also had a column called Shots in the Dark. And in that, he told the human interest side of this hospital. He told about the little dog that showed up that wouldn't leave. They nicknamed him Polio Pete, suspecting that his owner was inside. He is the one who told this story in such a way that other papers wanted to tell it as well. Life magazine showed up, did a spread on it. Radio reports about this. All sorts of ways this story started getting out as a life-affirming event here in Polio City, what they called Polio City, Hickory, North Carolina. It became America's Miracle City. Now, Wake would even tell on himself from time to time, because there was an instance when he didn't want to go out and take pictures, and Dr. Gaither Hahn said, tell you what, if you will, I'll get you a big old drink of liquor. He wrote about that in his column. All through the summer, stories about this hospital came out until finally, at the end of the year, when the National Foundation was doing its fundraising, they used this story as an example for people to give. They did a short before the feature picture, seeking donations, those dimes. One serviceman from Catawba County who was in Oregon said he saw it on the movie screen in Oregon and was very proud of his hometown. This was what people called a miracle. Now, was it? Well, for one thing, when it first started, people didn't expect much from Hickory. They didn't even know where Hickory was. Hickory was this mountain town where we all wore overalls and we all farmed and grits flew out of our mouth the moment we started speaking. That's what they thought about us. But they were surprised at first, and then they were impressed by what they saw from this communal effort. And if you want hard numbers, let me give you this. The epidemic the year before in Chicago netted an 8% death rate. The National Foundation said, if we can keep it at that, in Hickory, we'll be doing good. Our death rate wasn't 8%. It was less than 3%. We're coming up on the 75th anniversary of this miracle that a doctor first referred to in the national press, and it sort of took on a life of its own. And we have a wonderful story about Hickory to tell. We should be shouting it from the mountains and the valleys below. We've also got some really great artifacts here. One of the most impressive, I think, is a window into that hospital so we can actually see it. This was shot by Norman Mowry. Dan was his son. Dan was a patient at the hospital. Norman was an amateur cinematographer and gives us the only color footage of this hospital. And look at what it shows us. It shows us the treatment. It shows us the face of those patients as they're receiving it, as they're learning to walk again. It shows us the hot water treatments. It shows us the nurses and their grim determination to make these kids walk again. It's a way that we learn what this is all about. And it's invaluable. Hopefully we're running this stuff 300 years from now to show what this moment in our history was like. So what can we learn from it? What can this experience tell us? Well, it tells us we don't have to prove a thing. When adversity comes, we're ready. We've done it. It shows that we can work for mutual benefit, because anytime we're volunteering to help others, we're helping our community, which helps ourselves. But I think for us, for you and me, it can be very instructive the next time we face a very dark hour, because we can look back at the decision that Nurse Allen and Dr. Wims and Dr. Hahn made and look at the choice they had before them, because they could have cut and run. Some people did. Or they could have faced up to it and flipped it, turned it from their worst moment to their best. These are just some of the images that you will see from this hospital. These are some of the things that went on there that really should inspire us, because a problem is all how we understand it. It's how we conceive it to be. And if we can think of it in different terms, as they did, we can make a real difference. Does it have to be in times of catastrophe? Well, you see it in small cases every now and then. Over at Lenore Ryan earlier this year during the political rally, there were two sides getting ready to go at each other, and a group of good-hearted people joined arms and began singing hymns, diffused that situation. So you do see it in small increments. But I think we can do it again. And does it take polio? Maybe. But since we know, since we've been tested, we know we're ready for that challenge. We're from Hickory. And so when the 75th anniversary comes, it should be a great time of celebration, because we're losing some of these folks, as we have over the years. But they're still there to tell us what it was like. And after they're gone, we've got Norman Mallory's film. Now, I don't think the folks, Nurse Allen and Dr. Wims and Hahn, thought of it this way. But if nothing else, the hindsight we have gives us the opportunity to look back on it and say, we should make the right choice. And if for no other reason, we should do so because history is watching. Thank you for letting me tell this story.